The chains around my wrists were not made for a human body, but the Dominion never cared about comfort. They cared about control. I stood in the center of the transfer ring, surrounded by creatures 3 times my size, and every single one of them was staring at me like I was already dead. My name is Reese Calder. Once, I flew ships that carried the flag of Earth. Now I was property, tagged and numbered, the last confirmed human in the entire Kethrani Dominion. Number 741. That was what the guards called me when they bothered to speak to me at all. The arena announcer's voice still echoed in my skull even hours after my last fight. A crowd of thousands screaming for the death of the weak species, the extinct species, the joke species that thought it could stand against the stars. I had survived that fight. I had survived every fight they threw at me. Survival, though, was starting to feel like its own kind of punishment. Guards pushed me forward through a corridor lined with reinforced glass. Behind that glass stood buyers from a dozen different worlds, each one inspecting the latest shipment of captives like they were browsing crates of fruit. I kept my head high. I had learned a long time ago that showing fear only made the crowd hungrier. A Kethrani officer barked something into his wrist device, and the doors ahead slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. I was shoved into a smaller chamber, cleaner than the holding pens, with soft lighting that felt almost wrong after years of harsh floodlights and iron bars. Standing in the center of that chamber was a woman unlike anyone I had seen since my capture. She was Savari, the ruling species of the Dominion, tall and pale-skinned, with silver eyes that seemed to catch the light strangely. Her robes were dark, simple, nothing like the gaudy displays of wealth I had seen on other nobles. She did not look at me the way the others did. There was no amusement in her expression, no cruelty, no boredom. She looked at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "This is the one," she asked the guard beside her, though her eyes never left mine. "Yes, my lady. Human designation 741. Undefeated in the Western Circuit. Difficult to manage." "Leave us," she said. The guard hesitated. "My lady, protocol requires." I said, "Leave us." Her voice did not rise, but something in it made the guard's spine straighten immediately. He gave a short bow and backed out of the chamber, sealing the door behind him. For the first time in years, I was alone with someone who was not trying to hurt me, sell me, or watch me bleed for entertainment. I said nothing. I had learned that silence was safer than curiosity. She circled me slowly, studying me the way a scientist studies a specimen that refuses to behave the way the textbooks predicted. "You have killed 11 opponents in the arena," she said. "Savari, Trask, even a Voth heavy fighter twice your size. Do you know what the reports say about you?" I stayed quiet. "They say you fight like something that has already decided it cannot lose, even when the odds say otherwise." She stopped in front of me. "That is rare. Most captives fight to survive one more day. You fight like you expect a different ending." "Maybe I do," I said. My voice was hoarse from disuse, but the words came out steady. Something flickered across her face. Not pity, something closer to interest. "The Dominion classified your species as extinct in spirit 30 years ago. Broken, compliant. A footnote in a war that lasted 11 days. She tilted her head. "You do not look broken to me." "Give it time," I said. "Everyone eventually breaks." "Do they?" she asked softly. "I have seen empires fall in less time than it took your species to stop fighting back completely." "I do not think you are the breaking kind." Before I could answer, the guard returned with a data pad, and I watched the transaction happen in front of me like it was the most ordinary thing in the galaxy. Currency exchanged, ownership transferred, my entire existence reduced to a signature on a screen. But then something happened that I did not expect. The guard turned to me, and for the first time since my capture, there was something like nervousness in his expression. "You understand what this means," he said, though I was fairly certain he was speaking to himself as much as to me. "Lady Ethera Solvin has invoked a formal claim. Under Savari ancient law, this is not a simple purchase." I did not understand what that meant, not yet. but I saw the way the other guards in the corridor stiffened when they heard her name spoken aloud, the way even the buyers behind the glass leaned forward to watch. She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could see the faint silver markings along her jaw, the kind only high nobility carried, close enough that her voice, when she finally spoke again, felt like it was meant only for me. "He belongs with me," she said. The words were quiet, but the effect on the room was immediate. The guard actually took a step back. One of the buyers behind the glass dropped whatever he had been holding. Even the air in the chamber seemed to change, like everyone present understood something I did not. "My lady," the guard said carefully, "a formal claim of belonging has not been invoked in this sector in over 200 years. Are you certain?" "I am certain," she said, still looking at me. "Process it." I studied her face, trying to understand what had just happened, why 4 simple words had turned a room full of confident, powerful beings into something close to uneasy. I had spent years learning to read danger in every room I entered, and every instinct I had told me that whatever had just occurred was far bigger than a simple sale. The guard's hands were shaking slightly as he processed something into his datapad. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed at a human before. It was not pity, it was not disgust, it was something close to caution. "You are now under the formal protection of House Salvan," he said to me, his voice tight. "No enforcer, no arena master, no buyer may claim you, harm you, or challenge your status without formally challenging the house itself. Do you understand what has been done for you?" I did not fully, but I understood enough to know that the woman standing in front of me had just done something that made powerful people afraid, and she had done it for a human she had never spoken to before that hour. "Why?" I asked her directly, ignoring the guard entirely. Ethera studied me for a long moment before she answered. "Because the Empire believes your species is finished. I do not make the mistake of believing everything the Empire tells me." She turned toward the door, expecting me to follow. "Walk with me," Reese called her. "We have much to discuss, and very little time before others notice what I have just done." I followed her out of that chamber, out of the transfer ring, away from the arena that had been the only world I knew for years. I did not know yet that I was walking away from one prison and directly into the center of a rebellion that had not yet begun. I did not know that the woman beside me carried a hatred for the Dominion deeper than my own, hidden behind centuries of careful patience. All I knew, as the doors closed behind us and the noise of the arena faded into silence, was that for the first time since my capture, someone had looked at me and seen a soldier instead of a broken curiosity. And somewhere deep inside me, a part I thought the arena had killed years ago, quietly started to wake up again. The ship that carried us away from the transfer station was small, fast, and clearly built for someone who valued speed over comfort. Ethera said nothing during the flight, staring out at the passing stars with an expression I could not fully read. I sat across from her, still wearing the restraint collar the Dominion had fitted me with years ago, waiting for whatever came next. "You can remove that," she said finally, without looking at me. "Remove what?" "The collar. It has not been active since we left the station. I disabled it the moment the transfer was processed." I reached up slowly, half expecting some trick, some final humiliation before the real punishment began. But when my fingers found the release mechanism, it opened without resistance. For the first time in years, I felt the metal fall away from my throat. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing and simply breathed. "You do not trust me," Ethera said. It was not a question. "Should I?" "No," she said simply. "Not yet. Trust is something earned, not given. I do not expect yours immediately. I only ask that you listen before you decide I am your enemy." I studied her carefully in the dim light of the ship's cabin. "Then talk. Tell me why a Savari noble just made an enemy of half the Empire to buy a human she has never met." She turned to face me fully for the first time since we had boarded. "My house was not always what it is now," she said, 3 generations ago, House Solvin stood among the highest ranks of Savari nobility. We opposed the expansion policies that led to your world's invasion. We argued, in the highest councils of the Empire, that conquest without limit would eventually consume the Empire itself, and we were destroyed for it, quietly, efficiently. My grandfather was removed from the council under false charges. My father spent his life rebuilding what little influence remained, always careful, always patient, always waiting. Her jaw tightened. He died 3 years ago, still waiting for a moment that never came. So this is about revenge, I said. This is about correction, she replied evenly. The Empire believes it cannot be challenged because no one has challenged it correctly. Every rebellion in the last century failed because it tried to fight the Dominion with force alone, against an enemy with more ships, more soldiers, more resources than any single world could match. Then how do you fight it? For the first time, something like a real smile touched the corner of her mouth. You do not fight an empire like this with force. You fight it with something it cannot predict, something it has already convinced itself does not exist anymore. I understood then, slowly, painfully, me. Not just you, she said, your species. I have studied your history in secret for over a decade, Reese Calder. I have read about your wars, your revolutions, the way your people rebuilt entire civilizations after disasters that should have ended you completely. The Dominion sees humanity as a footnote, a short, violent species that surrendered easily once shown enough force. We didn't surrender easily, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. We surrendered because 11 days wasn't enough time to organize a defense against ships that could level a continent in an afternoon. I know, she said quietly. I have seen the records the Empire tried to erase. Your world fought longer than any of the reports admit, longer than most species that met the Dominion for the first time. I said nothing, but something in my chest loosened slightly, some tension I had carried for years without realizing its full weight. I did not buy you as a trophy, Yathera continued. I did not claim you to display you at some gathering of nobles who would find your survival amusing. I claimed you because I believe the Empire has made a critical mistake in classifying your species as finished, and I intend to prove them wrong. By training one soldier, by training the right soldier, she said, one who has already faced this Empire at its cruelest, in an arena built specifically to break spirits, and who still stands in front of me with defiance in his eyes, instead of surrender. I studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for the lie, the manipulation, the angle that every powerful being I had encountered since my capture had carried. I did not find one. What I found instead was something closer to conviction, the kind that comes from years of careful, quiet planning rather than sudden impulse. You understand, I said slowly, that if this fails, they will not simply kill me. They will make an example of both of us. I understand exactly what I am risking, she said. I have understood it for years. I simply needed to find the right moment, and the right person, to begin. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered a new flight corridor, and outside the window I saw a massive estate rising into view, built into the side of a floating platform above a world I did not recognize. It looked less like a noble's home and more like a fortress designed to withstand a siege. Welcome to Solvin Reach, Yathera said. It will not feel like freedom yet. Not fully, but it is the first place in a very long time where no one will ask you to fight for their entertainment. As the ship descended toward the platform, I found myself staring at the woman across from me, still trying to understand how 4 whispered words in a crowded transfer chamber had somehow rewritten the entire direction of my life. I had expected to die in that arena eventually, another forgotten name added to a long list of defeated captives. Instead, I was being carried toward something far more dangerous than any single fight I had survived before. I was being carried toward a war that had not yet begun, and a woman who seemed determined to prove that neither of us belonged to the empire that thought it already owned us completely. The training grounds beneath Solvin Reach were nothing like the arena I had known. There were no screaming crowds, No betting screens flashing above my head. No announcer calling out my number like I was livestock waiting for slaughter. There was only silence, open space, and a woman standing at the edge of a weapons rack, watching me with careful, measuring eyes. "You fought in the arena with whatever weapon they handed you," Euthera said. "Improvised, reactive, effective, but never truly yours." "I didn't exactly get to choose my equipment," I replied. "No," she agreed, "but here, you will." Every weapon on this rack was pulled from several military archives, most of them decades out of active service, all of them untraceable to House Solvin if anything goes wrong. She gestured toward the rack. "Choose something. Not what feels familiar, what feels like an extension of how you already move." I walked along the row of weapons slowly, aware of the guards positioned near the training hall entrance, their eyes following my every movement with open suspicion. I had noticed it since arriving 3 days earlier, the quiet resentment radiating from Ethera's household staff, the way conversations stopped whenever I entered a room. "Your guards don't trust me," I said, picking up a mid-length blade with a weighted grip that felt oddly balanced in my hand. "My guards don't trust anyone outside the house," Euthera replied. "It has nothing to do with you specifically. It has everything to do with me," I said. "I'm a human. To them, I'm barely a step above the animals they hunt for sport." She did not deny it. Some of them believe that. It will take time and results to change their minds. I am not asking you to earn their approval. I am asking you to survive what comes next, regardless of what they believe about your species. Over the following weeks, our routine settled into something structured, demanding, and unlike anything the arena had ever offered me. Euthera brought in old Savari combat instructors, retired officers who owed her family old debts, each one skeptical of training a human until they saw me move. I remember the first time I sparred against Davin, a broad-shouldered Savari veteran who had spent 30 years in active Dominion service before quietly defecting to houses like Solvin that still remembered honor. He came at me expecting an easy victory, the casual arrogance of someone who had never fought a human before. I put him on the ground in under a minute. He stood up slowly, rubbing his jaw, staring at me with an expression that had shifted from arrogance to something closer to respect. "The reports were not exaggerating," he said quietly. "The reports rarely capture everything," Euthera said from the sideline, though I caught the faint satisfaction in her voice. Word of my training spread slowly through the estate, and with it, something began to shift among the household staff. The guards who once refused to make eye contact started watching my sessions from the doorway. The kitchen staff, who had avoided speaking to me entirely during my first week, began leaving extra portions during meals without comment. It was Davin who explained it to me one evening, after another long session in the training hall. "You must understand," he said, "our people have spent decades believing your species died the moment Earth surrendered. We were taught that humans accepted defeat easily, that there was no spirit left worth respecting. What you are doing here," Reese called her, "is proving generations of our own education wrong." "I'm not doing anything except trying to survive," I said. "That is exactly the point," Davin replied. "You survive like someone who refuses to accept the ending the Empire wrote for you. That is rarer than you realize, even among my own people." Euthera did more than arrange combat training. In the evenings, she brought me into a private study filled with old data archives, records the Dominion had tried to erase from public access. Together, we reviewed old Savari war tactics, ancient rebellion strategies that had once challenged the Empire before being crushed and buried in forgotten history. "The Dominion's greatest weakness," she explained one evening, "is arrogance built over centuries of unchallenged conquest. They have not fought a true insurgency in generations. Every rebellion collapses too early, too disorganized, too eager to strike before preparation is complete. And you think we can do better? I think patience combined with the right symbol can succeed where brute force alone has always failed," she said. "You are that symbol, Reese, whether either of us wanted that responsibility or not." I did not always agree with her methods. There were nights I argued that we were moving too slowly, that every day spent training was another day the Dominion tightened its grip on worlds still suffering under occupation. She would remind me, patiently but firmly, that rushed rebellions became forgotten footnotes, while patient ones became history that could not be erased. Slowly, I began to trust her judgment, not blindly, but through evidence, through the careful way she moved pieces into position across the political landscape of the empire without ever revealing her true intentions to outside observers. I also began to notice something else developing between us, something neither of us acknowledged directly during those early months. It was not romance, not yet, but something quieter, respect built through shared purpose. Recognition between two people who had both been told their fight was already over and who both refused to accept that ending. One evening, after a particularly difficult training session left me exhausted on the floor of the hall, Ethera sat beside me instead of standing over me the way she usually did. "Why does this matter so much to you?" I asked. "Your family already suffered because of the Empire. You could disappear, live quietly, avoid drawing any further attention. Why risk everything again?" She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I watched my father spend his entire life waiting patiently for justice that never arrived. He believed that patience alone would eventually be rewarded. It was not. He died believing the Empire would never change unless someone forced it to." "And you think I'm the one who can force that change?" "I think you are the beginning of it," she said. "Whether you succeed or fail, the Dominion will no longer be able to claim your species is finished. That alone matters more than either of us fully understands yet." Our quiet moment did not last. Within days, reports began arriving from contacts across the sector, warning that word of my continued survival and my accelerated training had reached beyond the isolated safety of Solven Reach. The Dominion had noticed. An official communication arrived at the estate less than a month later, delivered by a Dominion enforcement envoy whose posture radiated forced formality. Ethera received him in the main hall while I watched from a shadowed alcove, close enough to hear every word exchanged. "Lady Solven," the envoy said, "the Council has become aware of irregular activity concerning your recently claimed asset." "He is under formal protection of my house," Ethera replied evenly. "His status is not open for discussion." "The Council does not dispute the legality of your claim," the envoy said carefully. "However, reports suggest this asset is being trained beyond standard parameters expected of a claimed companion. The Council requests his immediate transfer for reclassification." I understood the meaning behind that carefully diplomatic phrase immediately. Reclassification meant execution, dressed in polite bureaucratic language designed to avoid open conflict. "That request is denied," Ethera said, her voice calm despite the weight of what she was risking. The envoy's expression tightened. "Lady Solven, I must remind you that continued refusal will be interpreted as defiance against the Council's authority. Your house's standing, already fragile after past disputes, cannot survive another formal accusation of treason." "Then the Council may proceed however it sees fit," Ethera replied without hesitation. "My claim stands. He remains under my protection." The envoy left without further argument, though the tension in the room did not fade with his departure. I stepped out from the alcove once the door had sealed behind him. "You just declared open defiance against the entire Council," I said. "I have been preparing for that moment since the day I claimed you," Ethera replied. "I simply hoped we would have more time before it arrived." Outside the windows of Solven Reach, the sky remained calm, undisturbed, giving no indication of the storm that had just been set into motion. But I had spent enough time in that estate to recognize the shift in Ethera's expression, the quiet resolve replacing her usual careful patience. The Empire had issued its ultimatum, and for the first time since my capture, I understood that whatever came next would not simply determine my fate. It would determine whether an entire rebellion had a chance to begin, or whether it would end before it truly started, buried beneath the same silence that had swallowed every failed uprising before it. The message arrived 3 nights later, disguised as a routine trade invitation from a neutral house called Varen, requesting a meeting to discuss resource agreements along the border territories. Euthera recognized it immediately as a trap, but she also recognized something more dangerous hidden within its careful wording. "They know we cannot ignore it," she said, studying the message on the projection screen in her study. "If I refuse a formal invitation from a neutral house, it strengthens the Council's claim that House Solven has become unreasonable, unstable, unwilling to participate in standard diplomatic process. And if you accept, then we walk directly into whatever the Council has prepared." She turned to face me. "This is not a trade discussion, Reese. This is an execution disguised as diplomacy." "Then we don't go. We must go," she said. "Refusing confirms every suspicion the Council already holds. Attending and surviving proves something far more valuable. It proves the Council's authority is not absolute." I did not like the plan, but I understood the logic behind it. We spent the following 2 days preparing as carefully as time allowed, reviewing every possible layout of the meeting location, every likely number of enforcers the Council might position around the perimeter. Davin insisted on accompanying us, along with 3 other guards who had grown loyal enough to Euthera's cause to risk direct confrontation with Dominion enforcement. It was not enough force to guarantee safety. It was enough to ensure we were not walking in completely unprepared. The meeting location was a neutral space station positioned along a quiet trade corridor, officially controlled by House Varen, but clearly influenced by Council interests given the unusual density of enforcement patrols stationed throughout the docking bays. I noticed the shift in atmosphere the moment we stepped off our transport ship. Too many guards for a simple trade negotiation. Too much tension in the air for something meant to appear routine. Euthera walked ahead of me with practiced composure, her expression giving away nothing despite the danger clearly surrounding us. I stayed close behind her, aware of every exit, every guard position, every possible angle of attack that years in the arena had trained me to recognize instinctively. The meeting room itself was elegant, designed to project neutrality and diplomatic calm, but the moment the doors sealed behind us, I understood the trap had fully closed. A Council representative stood at the head of the room, flanked by enforcement officers positioned with practiced precision along the walls. This was not a negotiation. This was a formal detainment, disguised behind polite formatting. "Lady Solven," the representative said, his tone deceptively pleasant, "thank you for accepting our invitation. Regrettably, this meeting serves a different purpose than originally stated." "I suspected as much," Euthera replied evenly. "The Council has reviewed your continued refusal to surrender your claimed asset for reclassification. Given the severity of your defiance, the Council has authorized immediate confiscation of the asset, effective now." Enforcers moved with practiced coordination, spreading through the room to surround us completely. I counted 7 immediately visible, likely more positioned outside the sealed doors. Davin and the other guards moved instinctively into defensive positions, though I could see the calculation in their expressions. 7 trained enforcers against 4 defenders, and 1 human was not favorable math. "You will not touch him," Euthera said, her voice steady despite the surrounding threat. "Lady Solven, further resistance will be classified as active insurrection against Council authority. I strongly advise." I did not wait for him to finish the sentence. Years in the arena had taught me that hesitation in a fight already decided was the fastest path to defeat. The moment the nearest enforcer shifted his weight to advance, I moved first, closing the distance before he could raise his weapon fully. The room erupted into chaos. I do not remember every detail of what followed with perfect clarity, only fragments sharpened by adrenaline and instinct. I remember disarming the first enforcer and using his own weapon against the second. I remember Davin fighting beside me with the discipline of a veteran soldier, covering angles I could not reach fast enough alone. I remember the moment the numbers began shifting against us, more enforcers flooding through the sealed doors that should have held far longer than they did, clearly reinforced ahead of time in preparation for exactly this scenario. I fought until my arms burned with exhaustion, until every movement became pure instinct rather than conscious thought, aware distantly that I was now surrounded on all sides, that Davin had been forced back near the far wall, that the numbers had grown far beyond what any single fighter could realistically overcome. An enforcer struck me hard enough to drop me to one knee, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to slow around me. I looked up, surrounded by enemies on every side, and understood with sudden clarity that this was likely the moment my fight finally ended. I thought of the arena, of every fight I had survived believing someone would eventually come. I thought of Yathera's words, the belief she carried that my species was not finished, that defiance still mattered even against impossible odds. I forced myself back to my feet. I do not know if it was pride, instinct, or simple refusal to accept an ending decided by someone else, but I raised my weapon again, prepared to keep fighting even though every calculation told me the outcome was already determined. And then Yathera's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding in a way I had never heard from her before. Enough. The word carried a weight that stopped the room cold. Enforcers hesitated, weapons still raised, but no longer advancing. I turned to see Yathera standing in the center of the chaos, no longer hidden behind careful diplomatic language, her expression carrying the full authority of her house laid bare for everyone present to witness. "You will lower your weapons," she said, "or you will formally challenge House Solvin directly, in full view of every neutral observer monitoring this station." The council representative's expression tightened with barely controlled anger. "Lady Solvin, this asset has actively resisted lawful confiscation, your continued interference." "He is not an asset," Yathera said, her voice rising for the first time. "He belongs with me, not as property, not as a claimed possession under ancient formality. He belongs with me because I have chosen to stand beside him, publicly, before this entire council, regardless of consequence." The room fell into stunned silence. I understood, even through the exhaustion and adrenaline still flooding my system, that she had just crossed a line far more significant than simple defiance. She had transformed a legal claim into a personal declaration, one that could not be quietly dismissed or reinterpreted by council lawyers seeking a technical loophole. "You understand what you have just done," the representative said quietly. "I understand precisely what I have done," Yathera replied. "I have made clear, before witnesses who will report this exchange across every observing house, that House Solvin stands openly against the Council's continued treatment of claimed beings as disposable assets." The enforcers looked toward their commanding officer, uncertain, caught between direct orders and the sudden political weight now attached to the situation. Attacking a noble house openly, in front of neutral observers, carried consequences far beyond a simple confiscation order. "This is not resolved," the representative said finally, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "The council will reconvene. Formal charges will follow." "Then let them follow," Yathera said. "I will answer every charge openly, in full view of the same observers currently documenting this exchange." The enforcers withdrew slowly, weapons lowering with obvious reluctance, clearly under orders to avoid escalating the confrontation further, given the unexpected witnesses now recording every word. Davin helped me to my feet as the tension in the room finally began to ease, though the atmosphere remained charged with something far more dangerous than before. Once we were alone, moving quickly back toward our transport ship, I turned to Yathera, still processing what had just happened. "You just declared that publicly," I said, "in front of witnesses who will spread it across the entire sector." "I know," she said. "That wasn't just a legal claim anymore." "No," she agreed. "It was not." I studied her carefully as we walked, searching for any sign of regret, any hesitation about what she had just committed herself to in front of witnesses who could not be silenced or bribed into forgetting what they had seen. I found none. "Why?" I asked quietly. "You could have stayed within the legal argument, kept it about status, about house protection. Why make it personal?" She stopped walking, turning to face me fully. because the legal argument alone would eventually be dismantled by council lawyers looking for a technical exception. A personal declaration, witnessed publicly, cannot be quietly reinterpreted the same way. She paused. And because it was true, Reese, I did not simply calculate this decision from strategy alone. I did not have a response ready for that. We stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the station corridor, both of us aware that whatever remained careful and calculated about our partnership had just shifted into something far more exposed, far more dangerous, and far more real than either of us had originally intended. Word of what happened on that station spread faster than either of us anticipated. Within days, other houses that had quietly resented council authority for generations began reaching out to Ethera through careful, indirect channels, testing whether House Solvin's open defiance represented an isolated incident or the beginning of something larger. The council, meanwhile, began mobilizing more openly, no longer content with quiet reclassification requests and diplomatic pressure. What had begun as an attempt to remove a single claimed asset had transformed, through one moment of unexpected defiance, into the opening confrontation of something the Empire had not faced in generations. I had stood alone in that meeting room, surrounded by enemies who saw me as nothing more than property to be reclaimed and discarded. But standing there, exhausted and outnumbered, I had not truly been alone. And for the first time since my capture, I understood that the Empire's greatest mistake had never been underestimating humanity alone. It had been underestimating what happened when humanity found an ally willing to stand beside it, openly, regardless of the cost. The weeks that followed the confrontation on the trade station moved faster than anything I had experienced since my capture. What had begun as a quiet act of defiance inside a single meeting room had grown into something neither Euthera nor I could fully control anymore, spreading across the sector like a fire that refused to be contained. Reports reached us daily through careful, encrypted channels. Other noble houses, long resentful of council authority but too afraid to act alone, began sending quiet inquiries. Occupied worlds that had lived under Dominion rule for generations started whispering about the human who stood against enforcers, and the noblewoman who declared her allegiance openly in front of witnesses the council could not silence. Euthera spent hours each day managing these fragile alliances, balancing careful diplomacy with the urgency of a situation that grew more volatile with each passing week. I spent that same time preparing for what both of us understood was inevitable. The council would not allow this defiance to continue indefinitely. Eventually, they would respond with overwhelming force. They're gathering enforcement fleets near 3 border sectors, Davin reported one evening, spreading a data display across the table in Euthera's study. Officially listed as routine patrol movements, unofficially, every house watching closely understands what this actually means. They're preparing to make an example of us, I said. Yes, Euthera confirmed, and likely soon. I studied the display carefully, noting fleet positions, patrol routes, the careful way enforcement ships had begun tightening around territories controlled by houses sympathetic to our cause. The council was not simply preparing to punish House Solvin directly. They were preparing to crush any possibility of wider rebellion before it could gain further momentum. We can't wait for them to strike first, I said. No, Euthera agreed. But we also cannot act recklessly. A rebellion built on impatience collapses as quickly as it begins. Over the following days, Euthera worked tirelessly to coordinate a response, reaching out to allied houses willing to commit resources, occupied worlds willing to rise in coordinated resistance, and quiet sympathizers still embedded within Dominion enforcement itself who had grown disillusioned with council rule. I trained harder than ever during those final weeks, aware that whatever confrontation came next would not resemble the arena fights of my past, nor the ambush on the trade station. This would be something larger, more coordinated, more consequential than anything I had faced before. The final confrontation began on a border world called Halvin, a heavily populated planet under strict Dominion occupation, chosen by the Council as the location to make their example public and undeniable. Word reached us that the Council intended to broadcast my execution live across the sector, using the moment to crush any remaining belief that humanity, or any species claimed as broken, could ever successfully resist. Ithera refused to let that broadcast happen unanswered. We arrived at Halvin with a coalition force larger than either of us had truly expected to assemble in such limited time. Allied houses contributed ships and soldiers. Occupied worlds sent volunteers willing to risk everything for the first real chance at resistance in generations. Even some Dominion enforcement officers, quietly sympathetic to years of unchecked cruelty, chose that day to stand against the very empire they once served. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed before. Ships clashed in the skies above Halvin, while ground forces engaged across the planet's surface, coordinated resistance meeting entrenched Dominion occupation in a confrontation that had been building for generations, finally breaking into open conflict. I fought alongside Davin and the soldiers of House Solvin, pushing through enforcement lines toward the central command structure where Council representatives had gathered to oversee what they still believed would end in my public defeat. Ithera fought beside me, no longer the careful, calculating noblewoman who had first claimed me in that transfer chamber, but a leader who had fully committed herself to the rebellion she had spent years quietly preparing. We reached the command structure as resistance forces across the planet continued pushing back entrenched Dominion positions, occupied civilians rising alongside soldiers who had trained for this moment without fully believing it would ever arrive. The Council representative who had once ordered my reclassification stood at the center of the command structure, surrounded by remaining enforcers, his expression carrying the first genuine fear I had seen from Dominion leadership since my capture began years earlier. "This ends now," Ithera said, standing beside me as resistance forces secured the perimeter around us. "You believe defeating one command post changes anything," the representative said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The Council commands fleets across 1,000 worlds. This rebellion will be crushed within weeks." "Perhaps," Ithera replied, "but you can no longer claim this species is broken. You can no longer claim resistance is impossible. That belief alone is enough to ensure this fight continues, regardless of what happens today." The representative had no response to that. Within the hour, remaining Dominion forces on Halvin surrendered the command structure entirely, and news of the victory spread rapidly across the sector, carried not by official Council broadcasts, but by independent networks eager to share proof that resistance had finally succeeded somewhere. The following weeks brought a wave of uncertainty and cautious celebration in equal measure. The Council, humiliated by the loss at Halvin, moved quickly to reinforce remaining territories, but the damage to their reputation for absolute authority had already spread too widely to fully contain. Other worlds began organizing their own quiet resistance, inspired by proof that occupation was not permanent, that even species declared broken could rise again given the right circumstances and the right allies willing to stand beside them. I stood on the surface of Halvin several days after the battle, watching civilians slowly begin rebuilding structures damaged during the conflict, children playing in streets that had been battlegrounds only days earlier. Ithera found me there, standing quietly among the recovery efforts. "You've been quiet since the battle ended," she said. "I've been thinking about the arena," I admitted. "Every fight I survived there, I told myself someone would eventually come. Some rescue, some ally. I never truly believed it. Not fully. I told myself that belief just to survive one more day. And now? Now I understand no one came for me because I expected rescue," I said. "You didn't save me because some ancient prophecy demanded it, or because the Empire owed my species a debt. You saved me because you refused to accept the story they told about both of us." Ithera studied me for a long moment, the quiet intensity in her expression softening into something warmer than the careful calculation I had grown used to during our earliest days together. "I did not claim you that day in the transfer chamber because I saw a symbol," she said. "I claimed you because, For the first time in years, I saw someone who reminded me that defiance was still possible. Everything that followed, the training, the alliances, the battle we just survived, all of it grew from that single decision. "And now?" I asked. "What happens next?" "Now," she said, "we continue. Other worlds will rise. Other houses will join. The council will not fall in a single battle, but they can no longer pretend this rebellion does not exist." I looked out across Halvan, at the civilians rebuilding their homes, at soldiers from a dozen different worlds working alongside each other for the first time in generations, united by nothing more than shared defiance against an empire that had convinced itself its authority could never be challenged. "You once told me I fought like someone who expected a different ending," I said quietly. "I remember," Ithera replied. "I think I finally understand what that ending looks like." She stepped closer, studying my expression carefully. "And what does it look like?" "It looks like this," I said, gesturing toward the recovery efforts surrounding us, toward the alliance we had built from nothing more than one quiet act of defiance in a crowded transfer chamber. Not a single victory, not a single battle won, just proof that the story isn't finished yet. Ithera allowed herself a rare, genuine smile, the careful composure she maintained during moments of political calculation finally giving way to something more personal. "He belongs with me," she said softly, echoing the words that had first pulled me away from the arena and into everything that followed. "I said those words as a formal claim once. I do not say them that way anymore." "Then how do you say them now?" I asked. "As a promise," she said. "Not because ancient law demands it, not because strategy required it, because I choose it, freely, regardless of what comes next." I stood beside her on the surface of Halvan, surrounded by the beginnings of a rebellion neither of us had fully anticipated when our paths first crossed inside a Dominion transfer station. The Empire remained vast, powerful, and far from defeated. Other battles waited ahead, other worlds still suffered under occupation, and the Council would undoubtedly respond with renewed force in the months to come. But for the first time since my capture, I did not face that uncertain future as a broken curiosity paraded through arenas for entertainment, nor as a single captive fighting alone against impossible odds. I faced it as part of something larger, standing beside someone who had refused to accept the ending the Empire had already written for both of us. The story of humanity's fall had been written by an empire that believed conquest alone determined the ending. But standing on Halvan that day, surrounded by allies who had risked everything for a chance at defiance, I understood that stories are rarely finished simply because someone in power insists they are. Somewhere across the sector, other worlds were already beginning to whisper the same quiet defiance that had first brought Ithera and me together. Whatever came next, however long the fight ahead might last, one truth remained clear: humanity was not finished. And neither was the rebellion that had begun the moment one woman refused to let an empire decide who I belonged to.